A look back at the remarkable life and career of one of the most mysterious figures in music history, Prince, through the prism of the record most widely perceived as his masterpiece, 1987's Sign of the Times. That's next on Booked on Rock.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock. This is the podcast for those about to read and rock. The podcast today is going to be about Prince. We've had an episode on Prince recently. Always happy to do another. And this time we have John McKie. He's the author of Prince, A Sign of the Times. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Eric, it's an honor. Lovely to meet you.
You decided to tell the story of Prince's life and career through the prism of one particular album, 1987 Sign of the Times. Talk about that.
There's a lot. If you know about Prince, and most people do know about Prince, you will understand that as pop music goes, he's as good as it gets, I think, in terms of the way he played guitar, the way he played bass, the way he played drums, the way he sang. There's few in line with that, Paul McCartney, maybe, Stevie Wonder, maybe. But in terms of, what he did and, his fashion template, David Bowie he's in a class of very elite company. So if you then understand about Prince that he's as good as it gets when it comes to pop music, when was he at his very best? And a lot of people would say Purple Rain, because that was the high watermark commercially. Some people would say the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2004 when he did the guitar solo to pay tribute to George Harrison, or the Super Bowl, which some people would say was the best Super Bowl halftime show ever. But for me, I think 1987, Sign of the Times, you're talking about the best person in pop music being the best he ever was, because I don't know if anyone's had a chance to see the Sign of the Times movie on IMAX recently, but that is Prince dancing, singing, playing guitar, playing drums in a way that few could. The Sign of the Times album, I think, shows the best number of sides to him. I think if you want to understand Prince, there's ballads, there's rocky ones, there's songs that are very much in a class of their own in terms of something like the Ballad of Dorothy Parker or If I Was Your Girlfriend. I don't think anybody else could have done records like those. So for me, I'd always been fascinated by this record, Sign of the Times. Prince cultivated mystery. So for me, it was the challenge of, okay, well, can I find out how he actually made this record? Can I find out it was the same year that he did the Black Album and then pulled it? It was the same year he did the movie and then maybe flubbed the distribution of it. How can I find out how this remarkable man had this remarkable year and how he did it and who he was?
Talk about where he's at with his career when he begins to create the album Sign of the Times. Commercial high with Purple Rain, but then the follow-up project, not received well under the Cherry Moon. Revolution also comes to an end. So this is a period where he's coming back from some adversity.
Yeah, and I mean, the story personally, if I can move away from Prince and talk about me, if it's not indulgent, is that I wrote a feature for the BBC News in 2017, and it was the 30th anniversary of Sign of the Times. And I didn't really get close to the subject matter, but part of the reason I wrote the book was I sort of thought, I wrote this feature and it was only, 800 words or something. And it was essentially, how come the guy who gets rid of the band with whom he had the greatest success, he splits up with a fiance that he thought he was going to marry and who lived with him, the first serious girlfriend he's had really that lived with him. And he's coming off the flop of Under the Cherry Moon where he's ridiculed. How does he go from that to his best ever record? And then I thought, and the light bulb in my head went, there's a book in this. And so fast forward to 2020 when lockdown happened and I finally drummed up the courage to write it. And the answer is that this was someone with incredible drive, with incredible work ethic, with incredible belief in himself. But he did also have help. And that was part of the reason I wanted to write the book, because, the Revolution do infuse a lot of the flavors of Sign of the Times, even though Prince recorded a lot of it on his own. A lot of the songs are about Susanna Melvoin, which is the woman that he split up with that I just mentioned. And he did have people around him in the studio sometimes when he made these records, not just engineers. So it was just figuring out how this singular, talented, mercurial individual created it when he needed help and when he didn't need help.
The opening to Sign of the Times is the title track. The world was in a different place. It's thought by many as his most socially conscious song to date. What was going on around Prince at that time when we hear this song? Because this is, as you know, for pop songs, usually pop artists do not tread in this territory. Not even rap groups like Public Enemy. You point out that too.
Yeah, I think Sign of the Times is a remarkable record. Sign of the Times was made partly in LA where there were earthquakes at the time. HIV/AIDS was becoming an issue. I thought what was fascinating was I don't know if you've seen the Questlove movie Summer of Soul, where the Harlem Festival, one of the recurring issues is people at that festival saying, "Why is the US spending all this money on space travel?" And this is a big, almost, social argument in the 60s. And fast forward to 1986, 1987, when Prince is making the record, and he's singing "Silly No" when a rocket ship explodes. So he was, I think, making on the console recording in his new house in Gulpen Boulevard when Challenger happened, which was the explosion of the NASA
April of 86, I think that was.
April of 86. And
Yeah.
that's the start of Sign of the Times. You've also got earthquakes in the West Coast. You've also got the emotional earthquake of splitting up with his girlfriend. You've also got, the book deals with there were makeup artists, were people around Prince's camp who were living with HIV, and people at that time were going, "What is this new thing that people are talking about?" It was also on the cover of the LA Times, which was in his hotel room when he was checking out one day. So Prince was, if you understand Prince, Prince was a student of lots of things. He was a student of music, obviously, and you can hear that. He was a student of the news. He was very clued up, certainly the older he got. He used to sit for hours in Paisley, and when he went to stay in his LA rentals and had parties there, he would have social rights leaders, he would have intellectuals, and he would sit and talk until wee small hours with them about all sorts of issues. So you hear that in Sign of the Times.
The lyrics: "In France, a skinny man died of a big disease with a little name. By chance, his girlfriend came across a needle, and soon she did the same."
As we said, it was I think was it 86 or 87 was the year of the first Public Enemy album, and Def Jam tour was 87. So rap music was growing its social consciousness. I mean, it was always socially conscious, wasn't it, hip hop? But certainly in the mid 80s, late 80s, bands, rap acts started becoming a lot more outspoken, or a lot more mainstream. I think they were always outspoken. But Prince would talk about politics, but he would do it in his own terms, just like everything he did. He'd play guitar, but he would play it in his own terms. He would choose the bandmates on his own terms. And Sign of the Times, the song, is definitely a man doing things in his own terms.
And it does make sense now, after reading that, why he declined the offer to sing on Michael Jackson's Bad. He didn't like the opening lyric.
I know he's talked about that, doesn't he? He said, "Who's singing that? Who's singing what to whom?" I think was his phrase to Michael Jackson. And I love the story that it's. I heard from Susanna told another writer, Turi, who's written a couple of excellent books about Prince. But I believe she told him that Prince re-recorded a version of Bad and sent it back to Michael Jackson. So this is how it's meant to sound. And there's a couple of stories in the book elsewhere of Prince doing that. There's a story which he was in a studio and he heard a bass player's rendition of something, and he was basically going to re-record it with his bass on it, and a little sign that said, "The bass you should have played on it," and send it back to him, which was very, very Prince in terms of how competitive he was. So I think, given how competitive he was, I don't think there was ever any chance of him recording with Michael.
But he looked at it, he says, "Your butt is mine." No.
Although I just say that, but one of the things the book does disclose, and I believe it was the first that I'd ever heard of it, was that Prince's engineers and people who worked at Paisley in the early 90s talked about Michael Jackson coming over to Minneapolis and actually asking what kind of console he wanted in Paisley. And they were discussing them working in some material together, which is tantalizing.
Oh, man. Yeah, there was a mutual respect between the two as artists, for sure. It's not, yeah, there was a competitiveness there, though. Prince had that competitiveness about him, but they also understood they were both two of the biggest male pop stars at that point. They could relate to that pressure to follow huge albums. So there was certainly a mutual respect. What did he send clips of all positive reviews to Michael?
Yeah,
It's just a nice little friendly, like, yeah, look what I did.
yeah, he used to send them to his ranch, then he had to fax to his ranch. But I think it was quite warm. So Michael Jackson used to send, clips of, and this was the days before the internet, the days before YouTube. But Michael Jackson used to send videos of, Sly Stone and early 70s shows. Go and check this out, which suggests a kind of warmness on Michael's part. But, Michael Jackson, whatever you think of him, whatever headlines he's had, he sort of remains, Thriller was the best-selling album of all time. And Prince was competitive, and Michael was competitive too. So when Prince did the dates at the O2 in London, Michael then announced even more dates at the O2 before he sadly passed. So that tells me that they both like to compete with one another.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Where that competitiveness comes from is interesting, and you get to that in the book. He was fiercely competitive, and you write about that coming from maybe the fact that he's from Minneapolis, right? The roots there. It's where his work ethic came from, in the sense that you had those brutal cold winters. It's like, what else are you going to do? You go in and woodshed, work, right? But also the fact that he was on the short end of the height scale, and that his friends, he could play basketball. He was a really good player, but because of his height, he wasn't going to get into college or NBA or whatever. But also his friends, his taller friends, were getting the girls. So those things he turns into a positive.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of his brilliance, really, is that this was someone that was going to win. When you talk about sports, he decided that he was going to win at music. So then, the book covers the fact that it talks about Jimi Hendrix, and it talks about Prince being a fan with his band of the Jackson 5 and Dancing Machine and things like that, and playing that in high school, and then learning the guitar, because he told Albert Magnoli, who's the director of the Purple Rain movie, he said, if I play the guitar, learn the guitar, it puts me in a place that Michael Jackson can't reach. And he was thinking about that even at an early age, and that's kind of remarkable. And then you think about Prince is always, I think, even among fans who are very protective of him and say there was no one like Prince, which is true. But I think because he was from the Midwest and he was born in 1958 and he sold a lot of records, particularly in the 80s, I think who else was like that? And I think Michael Jackson and Madonna are always going to be part of that conversation. And one of the things I think that's interesting about Prince is that although Desperately Seeking Susan was a hit, Prince, in terms of movies, with Purple Rain, he reached a place that they didn't quite reach in terms of that success. And, I think when he told his management team, get me a movie, I have to wonder if Michael Jackson was in his mind, because, Thriller had happened and he thought, I don't know if I can sell as many records as Thriller, but if I make a movie, I've got an advantage over him. And I think that's also part of the reason that he maybe didn't do the We Are the World single. And I'm only guessing here. But, with that level of competitiveness, that he probably didn't want to be bracketed alongside other people. Maybe he was just shy. But, you do wonder.
James Campion, author of a great Prince book that's just come out, was talking about that, because he gets into it in his book as well, about that Prince just wasn't comfortable recording with other people. It wasn't something he did. Just the way his personality was, just wasn't something he would do. And he kind of took some heat for that, but that's who he was.
Yeah, he would, absolutely. And I think I tried to compare. One of the things that I think the book does or hopes to do is compare Prince to other musicians. And some people could say nothing compares to Prince. It's quite a phrase, but for me, one of the things I wanted to understand is, okay, well, what was Stevie Wonder like in the studio as opposed to Prince? And, Stevie Wonder, I believe, put his drums on last, but also he liked to have people in the studio that could react to singing, so he would know how it was going. Whereas with Prince, he would record, it was very private, sacred space for him. So he would clear everyone out, including sometimes the engineers. He would work out technically how to record his own vocals, and he would record on his own. And I also think that part of that was that Prince did not think of himself as a great singer. There was maybe a lack of comfort in his singing, which I think we all maybe struggle with the sound of our own voice, even someone as talented as Prince. And so he would record on his own. And but what a
Yeah,
singer,
that's. I mean, he had amazing range, right?
he had a 4 octave range, and
Oh,
one of the things that I found instructive about writing the book is just the amount of great singers who paid tribute to Prince. And he might not have liked his own voice, but they certainly did. And most of us do, obviously.
oh, absolutely. And you mentioned Madonna's film. He had a lot in common with her. I mean, they shared commonality in the fact that obviously they were huge pop stars, but also skill, work ethic, sexually provocative. Talk about their relationship, friends, competitors, and collaborators.
That's right. And I think Prince and Madonna are very interesting. Alan Leeds, who was a great consigliere, if that's the right word, of Prince. He also worked with James Brown, and he sort of said, I didn't expect too much to come from that. And I think there's possibility that they were too similar in terms of why they didn't work together long term, why they didn't do an album together, for example. But if you look at both their careers, there are astonishing amounts of similarities. There are, as you said it, they were both very sexually provocative in the 80s and the early 90s. That was replaced by spirituality later on. They went through a period, in the 90s or the 2000s where it was, I'm an artist, I don't have to do all my hits in the show. And then, they've sort of made peace with the fact that people do want to hear them perform hits. They've both got a great ear. Michael Bland, who's one of Prince's drummers in the 90s, a lot of people's favorite Prince drummer, he was quite dismissive about Madonna to Prince, and Prince corrected him. And as he said, Prince straightened me out about that. And it's in the book where he said she knows exactly what she wants to hear. And she knows, and Prince would hunt for the perfect chord, the perfect sound, and she would be relentless until, he landed it. And if you look at the people she's worked with, she's very, very clever at getting the best out of them. So, whether that's Stuart Price, whether that's William Orbit, whether that's Nile Rodgers, whether that's Jelly Bean, whether that's Timbaland, um, she's very, very good at driving them to a place that they will help her be her best. And then I'm probably not giving her enough credit in terms of all the things that she's done on her own. Where again, she's, I think, very competitive.
Our guest is John McKie. He's the author of Prince's Sign of the Times. Let's talk about Prince's influences, another fascinating aspect of his background. There's the Holy Grail, Sly and the Family Stone, but he also loved Grand Funk Railroad and Joni Mitchell. That is absolutely fascinating to me. If you were to ask me what I thought his 3 favorite bands were, I would not have guessed those 3.
That's what somebody said. I mean, lots of people have got different versions of who Prince's favorite band were. And I think if you wanted to make a guesstimate, and that obviously that interviewer said that, but I think if you wanted to make a guesstimate, there's a few useful pointers. I think one is that Minneapolis radio, I think the Minneapolis spread of people is 90% white audience. So therefore, Prince grew up not just listening to James Brown or Sly and the Family Stone on the radio, but would hear Fleetwood Mac, would hear Joni Mitchell. So yeah, there's a widespread of influences there. And then if you wanted to stand back and think about it, a lot of people have said Jimi Hendrix is a favorite guitarist, but actually, if you listen to him, and if quite a few interviews said that it's Carlos Santana is the person who comes up again and again and again. I think the fact that he worked with Sheila E. certainly around the time of signing the Times, and she'd already drummed for Santana, I think would have been impressive to him. Prince's influences, I think if you look at him and you listen to him, you can't not hear and see James Brown. You can't not see the way that he would drive a horn section. You can't not see, he'd actually kneel on get down to his knees and pray sometimes.
Oh, on stage performance, yeah.
On stage. And Madhouse, over the jazz band that he worked with in that Sign of the Times period in 1987, wore capes. Again, you can't not think of James Brown. Listen to Hot Thing of Sign of the Times. I think was it Atlanta Bliss, Matt Bliston, the trumpeter that he worked with at the time. And I said, did he admit to the James Brown influence? And he said, I don't think you could not admit to it, but you couldn't hide it. So for me, as a band leader, I think James Brown is up there. But, Joni Mitchell was very profound for him as a person. Yeah, Sly and the Family Stone, absolutely. He loved Fleetwood Mac. Um, there's so many people, but Larry Graham as well. If you look at his 90s, he seemed to spend most of his time with Larry Graham, 90s and the 2000s. And he certainly loved Sly and the Family Stone.
You mentioned Fleetwood Mac. He wanted Stevie Nicks to sing on Purple Rain, correct? That is a story that Stevie's told.
Yeah, Stevie has told that. I didn't go into detail in that in the book because I think the thing about Prince World is things like that happen and then they disappear very quickly. So I think Stevie said that in an interview, and she said something along the lines of, I couldn't do justice to it.
Intimidated to the point, which is mind-boggling. It's Stevie Nicks, but
it's Stevie Nicks, and Prince loves Stevie Nicks. And I think I mentioned a microphone that you used in the studio, and I think that was a direct result of a recommendation from Stevie Nicks. And Stevie Nicks famously, I think, got into Prince from Little Red Corvette playing on the honeymoon when she was on a road trip with her husband. And I think her admiration for Prince lasted longer than her marriage. No offense to Stevie.
Yeah. Yeah. And that influenced Stand Back.
Stand Back is, Steve Lukather. I was lucky enough to speak to him, and what an incredible career he's had.
Absolutely.
And I love the story about when Jimmy Iovine and Stevie Nicks were in the studio and they said, we want the sound that Michael Jackson had for Beat It. And they actually got David Williams, who played on Beat It, and it wasn't the sound they wanted. And so, they ended up asking Steve Lukather to do it. And that stuff like that, I love stories like that in the 80s. So, for example, I really wanted to interview Jay Graydon for the book. And part of the reason I wanted to interview Jay Graydon for the book was that, for those who know, Jay Graydon was in and out of Sunset Sound Studios in LA at the time. And that's where a lot of Sign of the Times was made. But part of the other reason I wanted to interview Jay Graydon was Jay Graydon is famous in rock and roll history. And this is not really about Prince, but again, I just love this stuff. Is that Steely Dan, when they were making Peg, and they wanted a certain sound on the guitars. And I think Jay Graydon was session guitarist number 8 who was brought in.
Oh.
So the first seven didn't work out. And it only took Jay Graydon, who was like the 8th attempt, the 8th guy to step in before they were happy, which tells you a little about Becker and Fagan and, the way they run a studio. But for those who say, I just want to hear about Prince, part of the other reason I wanted to speak to him was that he was in and around Sunset Sound when Prince was making these records. So for those who don't know, Prince would record often in Minneapolis, but he would also record in Sunset Sound Studios in LA, which is where Fleetwood Mac finished off Rumours, which is where Boris Pickett did the Monster Mash, which is where Eddie Hill in Studio One did Eruption, which, will be
you see the Van Halen banner behind me,
yeah, that's why I mentioned it. And obviously Steve Lukather, who I mentioned a minute ago, was best mates with Eddie. And, Steve Lukather and I think Jeff Porcaro were playing on Thriller as well. So you had Michael Jackson down the road to Westlake, to go back to him. And you had Prince in Sunset Sound in his own studio, Studio 3.
3 was his favorite. And there was a basketball court behind the building that he played at.
Yeah, he played all the time. And Kenny Rogers, Richard Marx, and David Foster, I think, who's not interviewed in the book, but he did introduce me to Jimmy Jam, which I was very lucky to speak to him towards the end of the process of writing. But he had studios for Earth, Wind and Fire and Sunset. So he ran a couple of rooms where he was just constantly moving. And you listen to the Earth, Wind and Fire records and you can hear the amount of sonic work that's gone into them. And you can hear the musicianship and the ability that those guys had.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
It's intermission time.
Prince could turn a mistake into art. Michael Bland, Prince's drummer from the 90s, told you there was no such thing as an accident in the studio.
Yeah, one of the things the book does is that for those listening who decide that they don't like Prince, and that's okay, I would still encourage you
to. Are they out there?
Well, I don't understand. I wouldn't. It's a species I don't really understand. But
is something wrong with them? What's going on?
I can't help them. But what fascinated me was that the other musicians that Prince has got in common with, and Prince was also around that time of Sign of the Times. That was mooted to do a record with Miles Davis, and so when I went into research for the book, I became fascinated by Miles Davis as well. And the reason I mentioned Miles Davis here in answer to your question, which I will come to answer your question, is that Miles Davis didn't talk when he worked with bandmates about mistakes. He talked about interesting choices. And, he would talk about if you play a wrong note, make it sound like you meant to play it the same note. And Jay Graydon, that I mentioned a minute ago, said that when he played a wrong note or a mistake note, whatever you want to call it, he would then play it as part of a sequence to make it sound like that was what he'd meant to do all along.
Isn't that amazing?
It is amazing. And so the happy accident, as I call it, is something that I became fascinated by. And just the opportunity to kind of write about how, the several songs on Sign of the Times where quote unquote mistakes are turned into making it sound like it's meant to sound. So the ballad to Dorothy Parker, Susan Rogers, who was his engineer at the time, had installed a new console and the sound was dull and flat. And Prince just didn't even comment on it. So she'd kind of made a quote unquote mistake. And he said, "Oh, the console sounds, different." But again, part of the reason that the ballad of Dorothy Parker sounds so weird is maybe to do with that. Forever in My Life, which again is got center stage of the movie, there's a refrain that he sings as part of the chorus, and that is an accident, and it's turned into a recurring theme. And again, I was lucky enough to interview Patricia Rushen, the great Patricia Rushen, and she talked about Freddie Washington's bass playing on Forget Me Nots, and that was actually the start of a mistake. Now, I don't think anyone could listen to Forget Me Nots by Patrice Rushen, which has been sampled to turn into #1 hits by George Michael and by Will Smith, and go, that was a mistake. That's someone who's a A-grade musician knowing what to do and knowing how to turn it into gold.
Now, to his personal life, Prince had one child with his first wife, Maite Garcia. Their son, Amir, was born a month premature on October 16th, 1996, died after 6 days, diagnosed with a rare genetic disorder of the skull called Pfeiffer's syndrome type 2. Not surprisingly, that devastated Prince. He really wanted to raise a family.
Yeah, the book, as you suggest there, the book takes into Prince's childlike energy. And, one of his former managers, Ruth Arzati, who's wonderful interviewee, and she talks about the innate creativity of a child, says, "Look what I made." And if you think about Prince, that's what he's all about. And the book is chock full of stories about employees and colleagues who bring their kids to concerts, and Prince almost ignores them and goes straight to the children. And part of the reason that was in the book was not just to pry into his personal life, and obviously, what he went through is devastating. The reason that's in the book is because if you listen to Starfish and Coffee, which is the song that he performed on Muppets Tonight, there's a childlike energy to it. If you listen to Housequake, which talks about green eggs and ham, which I believe references Dr. Seuss, you listen to Play in the Sunshine, where he talks about Harvey and the big white rabbit begins to talk. There's an Edward Lear nursery rhyme on It's Going to Be a Beautiful Night. So this was someone that tapped into that energy of when he was a child. Prince, not to talk about Sign of the Times, but Prince, when he was very young, played piano in school talent shows. And one of the things he played was the Batman theme. So when it came to 1989, 1990, Tim Burton give him a ring, he's not going to be able to resist that.
Jumped at that chance.
Yeah, he's jumped at that chance. And then, you see that with the people that he worked with. So people like Larry Graham and people like Shaka Khan, they were a big part of his childhood growing up. He played regularly with Stevie Wonder on private occasions for the White House and parties in LA. And that wasn't an accident.
You write about Prince as a boss and in business dealings. Quote from the book, "Whether Prince paid you well or not depended on your expectations."
Yeah, that was difficult to write about because everyone has different expectations around Prince, and everyone has different realities, if you like, and they all worked with him at different stages of his career. And for me, the important thing is, because Prince isn't around anymore, I really wanted to be fair to Prince. So when somebody said he underpaid me, or somebody else said, I was happy with what he paid me, I tried to include all those voices in the book. It's a challenge because I think if you look at his early part of his career, going on tour at the time, he was pretty rough on them. So when they went on tour with Prince in the time and Vanity 6, the time were kept off the bill in New York and LA so that Prince could make sure that he got the most credit. The time we're not getting paid a lot, it was, somewhere between $117 and $150 a week. When you think about what people get paid for tours now, is mind-boggling. But then a lot of people that worked with him, engineers, musicians, in the 21st century have got no complaints and are very happy with what they paid them and say he was very generous. So for me, he did a huge amount of philanthropic work as well. So for me, it was just about reflecting that in the book as accurately and as fairly as I could.
His relationship with Warner Brothers, when we talk about that before and after Sign of the Times, things got tense, contentious, I guess, after this album because Lenny Waronker of Warner Brothers wanted a double album. Prince wanted a triple album. He went and cut tracks essentially without Prince's input.
Yeah, when you see cut tracks, and my understanding of it is that he had the conversation with him that it had to be a double rather than he talked Prince down from the ledge of making it a triple into double.
But that's right. Prince said, okay, fine. But Prince wanted to have say in which ones were going to be cut out. And that didn't happen.
Yeah, I wanted it. Lenny was a fascinating interview, and what I wanted to find out, and it's difficult because it's hard for him to remember everything that happened because it was a long time ago. But in the book, it recounts that Prince had a late night conversation with Lenny, and Lenny leaned on him, shall we say, to make it a double album. Prince was not happy about that. Lenny then got his team together in the morning and said, right, we've got to get to sequence this record and suggest to Prince how the triple might work as a double and maybe make suggestions about the sequencing and the running of the album. He then phoned management, just before lunch and said, okay, we're going to get to work on this. And management said, what do you mean Prince has already done it? Which I think, again, was very Prince, where Prince had turned it into a double himself and suggested the running order and the track list.
Did it end up being the one that he wanted, the track list then? That was...
Yeah, I think so. Because I think even although Prince... I think Prince gave not that many interviews, but I think if he was unhappy with the way Sign of the Times had turned out, I'd like to think we'd have heard about it in an interview by now. He gave enough interviews that if he says, oh, no, that's not... He also didn't look back, Prince. So I think he was very good at going, no, that's the way it should be. And that's one of the things that's very interesting about Prince. So when Prince went in to record a song rather, it was very rare that he wouldn't finish it in one day. And he would say to the engineer, oh, it's meant to be that way. So even when we talked about mistakes earlier, as you might call them, he didn't see them as mistakes. He just thought that's the way the record's meant to be. So my guess, and it is only a guess, is that he would probably see Sign of the Times, the double album, as the way it's meant to be.
How about Prince's female alter ego, Camille? He recorded an entire album under that pseudonym?
Yeah, well, this fertile period of 1987 was just a fascinating period of time. You've got the movie. It was the time that Bonnie Raitt and George Clinton were popping into Paisley Park, which was opening. You've got the mooted album with Miles Davis, which didn't happen. You've got the Madhouse Jazz Project, and there was going to be the Flesh Sessions, the Black Album, which was written for Chili's birthday, and you've got Sign of the Times, the double album, right in the mix of that, which was meant to be Dream Factory. And before that, you've also got Camille, which is, as you say, an album, because he was putting out so many records, it was an album by a female alter ego, which was, of course, Prince.
Here's where you talk about the vocal range, too. This is where he's getting way up there.
Way up there. And it's just fascinating because some of those songs, like If I Was Your Girlfriend, is a Camille track, really, when you think about it.
So that gives you an idea of what the album would have sounded like.
That gives you a very good idea of what the album would have sounded like. And I find If I Was Your Girlfriend a really fascinating case study of where Prince was at that time. Fascinating. Because sonically, it's different from anyone else. It's... if he's talking about a relationship where he wants a level of closeness that only a female would understand, and he's dating a twin, and he's the son of a twin, sometimes Prince is mysterious, and sometimes it's pretty easy to figure out what he was talking about. And I think If I Was Your Girlfriend is one of the ones where easier to figure out what he was talking about. And as I say in the book, if you look at um, if you look at like the early '80s records like Dirty Mind, Head and Sister, where they're quite shocking, and he's been provocative. As I said, Dirty Mind, he was looking to shock, and by this stage he wanted to share, and so there's an emotional maturity, if you like, to that.
Booked on Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this. Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Let's talk about relationships some more. He had a relationship with Kim Basinger. He was married twice, managed to keep those private. But Kim Basinger, a famous person, he was in a relationship with her, and it seems like that was a pretty serious relationship.
Yeah, the book goes into that in some depth. I had not planned to write about Kim Basinger in any detail, but quite a few interviews intimated that relationship was a lot more serious than it was first reported. And I think part of the reason that it was not reported as being serious is it was played out in Minneapolis. So Prince, I think, sent the Batman soundtrack to Kim Basinger, Jack Nicholson, Michael Keaton. I think Michael Keaton didn't get back. Jack Nicholson asked for money, which was ignored. And Kim Basinger had a phone call with him. And according to his personal assistant at the time, within 15 minutes, she'd booked a flight and he'd booked a hotel in Minneapolis. And they never used a hotel because she went straight to see him. And I believe that they were together for quite a few months. And, my understanding from interviewees is that she moved quite a lot of her stuff over to Minneapolis. She wants to work with him. That he went shopping with her, which, if you know anything about Prince, him doing anything with a girlfriend that didn't involve music is quite rare. And she was smitten, he was smitten. They used to play pranks together and employees. It's quite sweet in terms of some of the stories that people talked about in the book.
Yeah, that would have been amazing. What if they got married? That would have been quite a story for the media to follow.
Yeah, it's funny to think she would have got more publicity than she did when she was married to Alec Baldwin. But yeah, that would be even more. Yeah.
Sure. His performance at the '04 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremonies is legendary now. His guitar solo brought the house down. As for his style of playing the guitar, Randy Newman had an interesting quote. He says, Prince's prowess on other instruments informed his playing on guitar. His guitar ideas aren't the kind of ideas that a guitar player would have necessarily. How much of a fan of other guitars was Prince? Because you write, quote, Prince enjoyed guitarists, sort of.
Yeah, that's in reference to Jimmy Berringer, who's the very talented local player. When I say local to Minneapolis, who played on The Most Beautiful Girl in the World. And, some people at the time, I think Ricky Peterson that worked on it, sort of said that he sort of made that record as, so good. So Prince knew he didn't want to cut off his nose to spite his face. And so he knew it was good, but he didn't enjoy the guitarist being good. And Prince was a big fan of guitarists. I mean, I had to tread carefully because I don't play the guitar. But I also knew that this was guys who love rock and roll tend to love guitars, and guys who love rock and roll often play the guitar. And they care about gear and they care about guitarists. So I worked very hard in the book to figure out, both in terms of gear, what gear Prince loved, but also what guitarists he loved. And Prince, it was very rare that Prince was outclassed when he played with other guitarists. So, like Scotty Baldwin points out that he didn't play on stage with John Mayer too much or somebody like that, but he did play with some really amazing guitarists, from Wendy Melvoin to Sonny Thompson to Mike Scott. And the thing about Prince and guitar playing is you can hear Jimi Hendrix, but you can hear Carlos Santana, and you hear those lead solos, but you can also hear Tony Maiden, who was in Rufus and Shaka Khan's band. You can also hear Jimmy Nolan, who played the funk stuff with James Brown. And Hans Martin Buff, who was one of the engineers, said something very interesting that's also in the book, where he said Prince doesn't just write for his instruments. So if you were a guitarist as good as Prince, right, and you played this killer solo, if it didn't work for the record, he was talented enough that he could chuck it out. You imagine Prince in a band that could play guitar like that, and the lead singer or the producer goes, "Oh, we don't need that solo." You'd imagine they'd go nuts. They'd be like, "No, you're not allowed to do that. This is brilliant." Prince was so gifted that he could play this amazing solo, or we presume he could play a solo and go, "Well, it doesn't work for the record. I won't use it." So that's next level talent, really, isn't it?
We have to address the name change. Your comment on this is interesting, and I want to ask you about it. Why did he change the name first? But why do you say it was both a pivotal moment in his career and, in other regards, a footnote?
Well, if you think about Prince, and this is sort of my opinion, the great thing about writing a book is you get to sneak in little snippets of your own opinion, but I hope it's mainly, the opinions of the people that I interviewed as much as me, if not more. But the artist formerly known as Prince, he was, the butt of all sorts of talk show host jokes during that period. And, the squiggle or symbol or whatever you want to call him, people would sort of decry him. If you look at that, it's very brave move. It's very bold. It's going to war with the record company feels like it owns anything with the name Prince written on it. So he just goes, "Do you know what? I'm going to shut that down," and almost move to a different territory so that he can stake out his own claim for himself and his own work. So in some ways, it's incredibly brave, and in some ways, it's incredibly bold. But in other ways, it's just something he did. And it shows a lot. It displays his fearlessness. It displays his canniness, but it doesn't define him.
Yeah, I agree. I've said in the past, and maybe I'm incorrect about this, but I also thought he did it for other artists who are being taken advantage of.
One of the things that I took in different parts of his career outside of Sign of the Times was because I couldn't, as I said to you when I wrote that feature in 2017, I was like, but who is this guy? And, I interviewed something like, there was a lot of people I interviewed, but I was about 30 interviews in, and I sort of paused and I thought, I still don't know who this guy is that made this record. And that's why I kept interviewing people. And so part of understanding Prince, I think, is that, when he wrote Slave in His Face and people around him said he didn't do that a lot in the studio. So it was a moment in time where it was he was making a point, at the Brit Awards in '95, I think, when he had it in his face, that he was making a point, but it wasn't something he did all the time. The interesting thing about the Prince, TAF cap period symbol, whatever you want to call it, is that he would privately, people would call him Prince, and he would snap at them and say, "Don't call me that." If you're talking about Prince and other artists, you only need to look at what he did, owning his own masters. This is something that Anita Baker's talked about recently, that Taylor Swift has fought to control her own music. The fact that she's the first billionaire through music alone, I think something like that would have not escaped Prince's notice. And Prince sold music on the internet when it wasn't fashionable to do so. Prince went to war with big record companies long before other major artists felt the courage to be able to do that. Um, Prince just, you would turn down the obvious opportunity, and that's part of what makes his music career so interesting.
He had all those songs like "Nothing Compares to You" for Sinead O'Connor. I mean, it's amazing how much he wrote, and then he just shared them with other artists. Say, "Here you go."
What's really amazing, and nobody, I think, will do this again, and I can't think of anyone who's done it before, is Prince was making and recording so many records that he invented the time. And, as the book suggests, some of the time were kept out of the studio so that Prince could make time records, which is kind of funny. So he created the time, and his fingerprints are all over those records. He created Vanity 6, and his fingerprints again are all over those records. And so he actually, and the time and Prince were in a degree of competition when they went on tour together. So Prince actually created his own competition. And there's two things to note of that. One is that, how prolific that he was able to do that, but also he was shining a spotlight in Minneapolis. So people would talk about the Minneapolis scene. And actually the Minneapolis scene was effectively, with all due respect to the other musicians around at the time, one guy who was just making it feel like the most happening place in music.
Booked on Rock Podcast will be back after this.
Come back soon, okay? I mean, you know where we are. Tell your friends.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. His death in 2016 was a shock. He was only 57. At one point in the book, you write, quote, Prince left the earth with unanswered questions about him. This was not accidental. Do you feel after writing the book, maybe you're able to get a little bit closer to who Prince was as a person?
Absolutely. I feel like it was funny when, towards the later stage of interviewing, people would tell me stories. And I never met Prince, but people would tell me stories about things they'd said in front of him. And I was thinking, oh, he's not going to like that. Or, oh, he's going to like that. And, but towards the end again of reading about him and finding out about him, I would read interviews from people that people had done later in his career. And they would say certain things that they knew he was going to like and that would curry favor with him. So there were certain things that Prince would respond well to, certain musical references that he would respond well to. I felt like I got to know him a bit better, but I also wanted to respect the mystery. He cultivated a mystery around him, and I think there are things about Prince that none of us will ever know, and that's okay. But this book is, I think, as close as I could get to for the neutral, or the observer, the music fan, to be able to find out about him. And I wanted to do as much of a 360 on Prince as I could.
Yeah, they just did an episode on Rick Ocasek of the Cars, who was a mysterious guy, and I think I prefer it that way. That's something that's lost on this era now, where we can find out so much about people because of social media, and everybody's got a phone, and you could film them, video them at any time, and I like the mystery. I like not knowing everything, and let us try to find out from the music, and let us try to find out maybe from the people that worked with that person or knew them, and come up with our own conclusion as to who they are.
Roy Bennett, Prince's lighting director, said something fascinating to me, where he talked about, and Prince and he had a really symbiotic relationship, where Roy Bennett, I think, is the only person who's actually suggested changing a set list of Prince's to Prince's face, and Prince was receptive to it. I think anyone else that had done that would have been,
oh yeah,
heading for the door very quickly. But Roy Bennett told me that he was told by Prince when to put the lights on him in a concert and when not to. So because Prince understood, being a rock star, that sense of anticipation, Prince knew when to disappear and when to appear. And there's a brilliant book, another example of that is there's a brilliant book written about James Brown called Kill 'Em and Leave. And it talked about the advice that I think James Brown talked about with Al Sharpton, where James Brown would do an amazing show and then leave in the door, or he would come in with an amazing anecdote and then leave. So by the time people turned around and went, oh, who was that? What happened? He was gone and on to the next thing. And Prince was an absolute master at appearing, dropping in a comment. He and you see that in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He's like a ghost, the way he sort of disappears at the end of it.
Yep, that's the way he wanted it.
Yeah, and that whole kill him and leave thing, I think, is very Prince, even though it was originally referred to as James Brown.
Prince, Sign of the Times. It's out now, wherever books are sold. John?
I hope so. It's out in the UK, and I hope that you can have it transported to your home, wherever that is. But it's out in the UK at the moment.
And look for it at your nearest bookstore. You can also go to bookedonrock.com to find it at your nearest independent bookstore. And can people find you online, John? Reach out to you?
Yeah. I'm John McKie on Twitter. I'm Johnny18, which is the Scottish spelling, HNNIE 18 on Instagram. And I'm on LinkedIn. And in fact, social media helped me write the book because I found interviewees on Facebook, I found them on Twitter, I found them on Instagram, and I found them on LinkedIn. So not TikTok as yet, but all the other social media outlets were very useful for helping me track down people.
Yeah, that's the great part of social media. I know people tend to focus on the downside of it, but social media does have those benefits. So go out and get this book and go out and listen to A Sign of the Times. Like I told you before we started recording, as I'm reading your book, I'm playing it from start to finish and just amazed at how brilliant the album is. And I would say that I Could Never Take the Place of Your Man is my favorite from the album and one of my favorite Prince songs, period.
That's a good call. I mean, it's great, and it's you can hear a bit of everyone in that. You can hear Carlos Santana, you can hear a little bit of James Brown. Most of all, you can hear Prince, and that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, that's a callback to his Purple Rain days, I think. Right? Wasn't that written back then?
Yeah, it was a song that was kicking about for quite a while before. I think I Could Never Take the Place of Your Man and Strange Relationship date back to the early 80s, maybe in the late 70s in one case.
Well, out of fairness, I should, before I let you go, what's your favorite track from Sign of the Times?
Whew, one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, and you'll see with the book, it's 16 chapters, and each 16 chapter is the song that showcases Prince's personality. So I know you wanted a short answer to this probably, but sometimes it's Sign of the Times.
As long as it needs to be.
Sometimes it's Sign of the Times, and that speaks to social activism, so that's why that's covered in that part of the book. Sometimes it's Ballad of Dorothy Parker, which speaks to his idiosyncratic nature. Sometimes it's Starfish and Coffee, which speaks to how he was, that childlike capacity that he had. And sometimes it's You Go to Look, because he knew his way around a good pop song. So it depends what day you ask me.
All right. Perfectly answered. Perfectly answered, John. Thank you so much for being here. Congrats on a great book. And hopefully we'll have you back on again in the future.
Absolute pleasure, Eric. All the best.
That's it. It's in the books.